1,240 meters. A bullet had already passed clean through her left shoulder. Her arm hung useless. Blood soaked the packing faster than she could hold it, and the man who put it there believed she was finished. Doc Command said hold. She didn't hold. She never had. 400 meters back, on a different ridge, on a different night, 12 Marines watched a 118-pound Navy corpsman lift a rifle nobody ordered her to touch. 2 shots. 1 miss. One that ended a man before he could put a round through her commanding officer's skull. Then the silence. That terrible, absolute silence when a unit realizes the small woman who patched their wounds is something else entirely. Where did you learn to shoot like that? She was tired of hiding. My father taught me. Coulter Calloway. Navy SEAL. Call sign Wraith. 5 years ago, somebody sold him a coordinate that got him killed. She was about to find out exactly who. The dust came first. Before the sound. Before the Humvee even slowed at the gate. Dust rolled up off the New Mexico flats and hung there in the white afternoon light like something that refused to settle. Camp Ridgeline sat low against the horizon. Concrete and razor wire and heat that shimmered off every flat surface it touched. Emery Calloway pressed her palm against the window glass and watched it grow larger, watched the guard shack materialize out of the shimmer, watched the flag hang dead still in air too hot to move. 27 years old, 5'4", 118 pounds soaking wet, which she currently was, because the Humvee's air conditioning had given up somewhere around mile 40 and never come back. She'd heard all the words already. Small, young, wrong for this. She'd learned to let them pass through her like weather. The driver, a corporal who hadn't said 6 words the entire ride, pulled up outside a low administrative building and killed the engine. Silence rushed in to fill the space the engine had left. Just wind now. Just the tick of a cooling engine block, and somewhere, far off, the flat crack of rifle fire on a range she couldn't see yet. This is you, ma'am. Not ma'am, Doc. She'd correct him eventually. Not today. She climbed out. Duffel bag over one shoulder. Medical ruck over the other, both of them nearly as heavy as she was, and stood there a moment just breathing it in. Sand, diesel, gun oil. The particular smell of a place built entirely around the practice of violence. Home in its way, the only kind she'd ever really known. The medical tent was cooler than the air outside, but not by much. Rows of supply shelves ran floor to ceiling. Hemostatic gauze and chest seals and combat tourniquets rated for 250 pounds of pressure, all of it labeled, all of it counted, all of it waiting. She started counting again anyway. Because that was what you did. Because a miscount meant a hand reaching for something that wasn't there when a Marine was bleeding out in the dirt, and she would not be that kind of medic. Morphine auto-injectors. 12. She counted them twice. She always counted twice. The tent flap moved. A man ducked through it, broad enough that the canvas seemed to shrink around him. Gray at the temples. Gray eyes to match. Gunnery sergeant stenciled across his chest in faded thread. You're the new corpsman. Not a question. She straightened anyway. Yes, Gunny. Marsh. He didn't offer a hand. Just looked at her the way men like him always looked at new arrivals, cataloging, weighing, deciding how much rope to give before deciding she'd hang herself with it. You got a name, Doc, or do I just call you new girl for the next 6 months? Calloway. Something moved behind his eyes. Small. Gone before she could name it. Calloway, he repeated like he was testing the weight of it. All right, Calloway, gear up. Briefing's at 1600. Don't be late. Colonel hates late. He turned to go. Stopped at the flap. You ever worked recon before? No, Gunny. Didn't think so. Not unkind. Just fact laid down flat like a card on a table. It's different. We move fast. We don't stop for much. You fall behind, you get left behind. That's not cruelty. That's math. He glanced back at her, at the 118 pounds of her standing very straight in the tense gray light. You keep up? I'll keep up, Gunny. He studied her another beat. Then he nodded once and was gone. She let her shoulders drop the second the flap fell shut behind him. Just an inch. Just enough. Because that was the job too. Standing straight until nobody was looking, the briefing room smelled like burnt coffee in metal folding chairs. 12 Marines sat scattered through it in postures that read casual and weren't. She'd learned to see the difference. The stillness underneath the slouch. The way every single one of them had already clocked the exits without appearing to look. She took a seat in the back, didn't make eye contact, didn't need to. Invisibility was a skill like any other, and she'd had a lot of practice. Didn't work. Well, look at this, the voice carried. Loud, not cruel exactly, just staking territory the way certain men did without ever quite meaning harm by it. A staff sergeant, broad through the shoulders, turned in his chair to look at her. Somebody's little sister wander in from the PX? Laughter. Not mean, just easy, reflexive, the kind of laughter men used to keep from thinking too hard about what came next. She didn't answer. Kept her eyes on the map at the front of the room. Kept her face a closed door. Because reacting was losing. Because the fastest way to earn a room like this was to need nothing from it. The door at the front opened, and the room came up out of its chairs like something mechanical. All 12 of them snapping to attention in the same half second. She rose with them. Lieutenant Colonel Holt Bannerman walked to the front of the room like a man carrying something heavy that nobody else could see. 52. Sun-worn. Eyes that looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Seats they sat, he turned to the map. New Mexico. The border region south and west of the base, marked in grease pencil, red for hostile activity, blue for their own position. Intel's flagging increased trafficking movement through Sector 4. Weapons. Mostly. Some of it military grade, which is the part that should concern everyone in this room. He tapped the map without looking at it, like his hand already knew exactly where. We're running reconnaissance. Presence patrols. Nothing aggressive unless it gets aggressive with us first. His eyes swept the room. Found her in the back. We've got a new corpsman joining the platoon. A pause. A glance down at a folder he was holding. Thin, the kind of thin that meant most of what should have been in it wasn't. Callaway. Previous postings classified, which means nobody in this room asks about it. Clear? Clear, sir, in ragged unison. Callaway, his eyes found her again, held there a beat too long. Something working behind them she couldn't read yet. You qualified? M4 and M9, sir. Standard issue. Good. He looked away first. She noticed that. Filed it without knowing why it mattered yet. Your job is keeping these Marines alive. Everything else is secondary. Are we understood? Understood, sir. He nodded once and moved on to logistics, to timeline, to the small dry mechanics of running a platoon in a hot climate. And Emery let herself breathe again, slow. 4 counts in, 7 counts held, 8 counts out. The rhythm her father had drilled into her before she was old enough to understand why a person needed to control something as basic as their own lungs. She didn't think about that, wouldn't. Not here. After the briefing broke, the staff sergeant found her again. Coleman, his name tape read. Dax Coleman, arms crossed. Not hostile. Just testing. Callaway, sergeant. You ever seen real combat, Doc? Not the training kind. Fair question. Reasonable, even. She gave him an answer that was true and not the whole truth, which was a skill she'd had a lot of practice with. Some, Sergeant. Some. He turned the word over like a stone, checking its underside. Out here it's not some, it's constant. Low grade. Always sitting right under the surface. You freeze up, people die. You understand what I'm telling you? I do. We'll see. He started to walk off. Stopped. Half turned. Also, real talk. You gonna be able to hump a 50-pound aid bag 12 miles in this heat? Because I've seen corpsmen who looked like you before. They don't usually make it past the first patrol. She met his eyes, didn't blink. I'll make it, Sergeant. Something shifted in his face. Not respect. Not yet. Just the smallest crack in the door where respect might someday walk through. We'll see, Doc. He walked off. Emery's shoulders came down an inch, the tension leaving them all at once. Because this was the part nobody warned you about. Not the danger, the waiting, the proving. Over and over, every new posting, every new room full of men measuring you by the width of your shoulders instead of the steadiness of your hands. She was tired of it in a way she couldn't say out loud. The next morning she walked past the weapons range on her way to the supply depot, and her feet slowed down without her permission. She hadn't planned to stop. Through the chain link, she watched a young Marine working the firing line under Coleman's instruction. Lance Corporal, judging by the collar, baby-faced in the specific way that wouldn't survive contact with a place like this for long. He fired. The round went wide. You're jerking it, Fenwick. Coleman's voice flat with repetition. Squeeze, don't yank the trigger like it owes you money. Another shot, wider still. Emery's fingers twitched at her side. She shoved her hand into her pocket before it could do anything on its own, because she could see it. The stance was wrong, weight too far forward. elbow flared out instead of tucked. All of it wrong, in ways that lit up some old circuit in her chest she'd spent years trying to switch off. She turned and kept walking before anyone could catch her watching. Didn't make it far enough. Doc Marsh, standing at the corner of the supply depot like he'd been waiting there, though she knew he hadn't been. Gray eyes taking in everything at once. You shoot, Doc. Not a question this time either. Qualified on the M9 and M4, gunny. Standard issue, like everybody else. That's not what I asked. Her hands went still for exactly 1 second too long. She saw him notice. Saw the small flicker behind his quiet gray eyes, the same flicker she'd caught in Bannerman's faces the day before. Both men quietly cataloging something they couldn't yet name. I know how to shoot, gunny. Who taught you? She looked up at him then. Really looked. And something in his face wasn't suspicion. It was closer to recognition. Like he was seeing an outline of someone he used to know traced over her shoulders. My father. He nodded, slow. Didn't push for more. But his eyes dropped to her hands, to the calluses at the base of her fingers that didn't come from rolling gauze, and something in his expression settled into place like a puzzle piece finding its groove. Good to know, Doc. He walked off before she could ask what exactly he thought he knew. The days folded into each other after that. Heat and routine and the particular rhythm of a base that ran on habit, because habit was the only thing that kept people sane in a place this hot, this far from anything soft. Morning sick call. Afternoon drills. Evening inventory. She fell into it the way water falls into a shape it's already been poured into 100 times before. They tested her without meaning to call it a test. Small things. Whether she'd carry her own weight on a supply run. Whether she'd flinch at the crude jokes that came standard issue in a room full of tired young men far from home. Whether she'd complain. She didn't complain. Ever. Complaining was a door, and doors could be walked through by people asking questions she didn't want to answer. On the third day, they ran a conditioning march. 12 miles, full gear. 50 pounds strapped to every back in the formation under a sun that seemed personally offended by their presence. The kind of exercise built to find the weak point and press on it until it broke. Coleman set the pace, punishing but not cruel. Just honest about what the job actually asked of a person. By mile 4, a Marine dropped out with heat cramps. By mile 8, 2 more. Emery kept moving, one boot in front of the other. Heart rate controlled, breath counted, the 50 pounds on her back nothing more than an old, familiar weight she'd carried before in places she didn't talk about. She crossed the line without breaking a sweat that mattered. Coleman looked at her like he was doing new math. All right, Doc. Something almost like a smile. Maybe you can hang. That afternoon she ran combat casualty care training for the platoon. Stood in front of 12 men who'd seen more blood than most emergency rooms, and taught them things they thought they already knew. Because thinking you knew something and actually knowing it were two very different animals when the bullets were real. Tourniquet goes high and tight. She held one up, demonstrated on her own forearm, quick, economical. Not where the wound is, where the artery is. You've got 90 seconds before brain damage from blood loss starts setting in. Less if it's the femoral. Every second matters. Every single one. They leaned in. She had their attention now, and she'd earned it the hard way, the only way that ever really counted. Needle decompression, tension pneumothorax. 2 fingers pressed flat to her own chest, marking the spot without looking down. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. If breathing's labored on one side and getting worse, no matter what else you try, you don't wait. You decompress. You put the needle in and you pray you got the landmark right. Fenwick raised his hand, the one from the range. 23, still convinced somewhere underneath the sunburn that he was bulletproof. How do you know it worked? Rush of air when you insert. Breathing eases up almost right away. She looked around the room, let the silence carry the weight of what came next. If you don't get that, you try again. Different spot. You don't stop until they're stable or they're gone. Those are the only 2 outcomes you get to choose between. Nobody said anything for a moment. The room had gone very quiet, and it wasn't the quiet of boredom. It was the quiet of belief starting to take root. After the session, Fenwick lingered. Questions about IV placement, about finding a vein on a dehydrated patient, about what to do if blood pressure started tanking mid-procedure. She answered every one of them, patient precise, the way someone had once been patient and precise with her. Doc. He hesitated, young face gone serious in a way that didn't fit him yet. Where'd you learn all this? Like, really learn it. This isn't textbook stuff. She zipped her bag shut. Buying half a second. School, Fenwick. Same as everybody. Nah. He shook his head, and his instincts were better than his aim had been that morning. This is different. This is like you've done this. For real. More than once. She didn't answer. Picked up her bag and walked, because some questions didn't deserve lies and didn't deserve the truth either. Not yet. Not to a 23-year-old who still thought war was something clean. He was right, though. She had done it. In places whose names lived only in files stamped with words that meant forget you ever read this. She'd knelt in dirt while mortars fell and pressed her palms against wounds that should have killed the men underneath them. She'd called for extraction in more than one language while rounds sparked off stone near her skull. She'd done other things too, things that had nothing to do with medicine. But that was before the promise. On the 5th day, the heat found Fenwick. They were running movement drills at noon, full gear, the sun of physical weight pressing down on the whole exercise field. No shade. Temperature climbing somewhere north of 110, and the kind of dry heat that lied to you, that let you believe you weren't sweating even as your body quietly ran out of everything it needed to keep working. Emery stood with the command element under a strip of camouflage netting, watching. She saw Fenwick stumble, saw him catch himself, force his legs back under him, keep moving because that was what Marines did. Because stopping felt like failing and failing felt like something worse than dying. His face had gone red, too red. The specific wrong red that lit up every alarm bell she owned. She was already moving before she'd finished deciding to. Coleman's voice cut across the field. Doc, we're mid-drill. Pull him out. He's fine, he just needs to. He has heat exhaustion progressing toward heat stroke. Core's probably past 103. 10 more minutes and he starts seizing. Pull him now, Sergeant, or I will. Coleman's expression flickered. He didn't like being overruled, especially not in front of the platoon, especially not by the new corpsman who'd been here 5 days. But something underneath the irritation recognized the certainty in her voice, and certainty like that didn't come from a textbook. He called the halt. She reached Fenwick just as his knees buckled, caught him, lowered him with a strength that surprised everyone watching, because 118 pounds wasn't supposed to be able to catch 200 pounds of falling Marine and not go down with him. His skin was hot and dry under her hands. Pupils uneven. Heart rate climbing past 105 and still climbing. Shade now. I need water and ice if we've got it. Somebody get a vehicle up here. Nobody hesitated. Not one man in that formation. She'd earned that much trust in 5 days, and she tucked the realization away somewhere quiet. Somewhere she'd sit with it later, when there was time to feel it properly. She worked with the focused calm her father used to call the eye of the thing. IV in fast, 18 gauge, saline running wide open. Ice packed against the groin and under the arms. Every technique automatic muscle memory built over years and multiple continents and situations she wasn't allowed to name out loud. Fenwick's eyes rolled back. His body began to seize. On his side, protect the airway. Nobody puts anything in his mouth. She'd seen this progression before. Knew exactly how the next 10 minutes would go. Knew that 10 minutes was the entire distance between a young man walking away from this field and a young man who never fully came back from it. Bannerman arrived at some point during the worst of it, stood at the edge of the shade, watching her work with a stillness that wasn't about calm. It was about recognition, about watching skill that didn't come from a classroom, skill that could only be built the hard way, in places where mistakes cost lives instead of grades. When Fenwick's vitals finally leveled when the seizure stopped, when his pupils began reacting to light the way pupils were supposed to, Bannerman exhaled something that sounded almost like relief he hadn't meant to show. Good catch, Doc. Just doing my job, sir. It wasn't just that. Everyone standing in that patch of shade knew it wasn't just that. She'd seen something nobody else had noticed, acted before there was time to think about acting, known exactly what to do in the exact moment it mattered, and that kind of knowing didn't happen by accident. That night in the chow hall, something had shifted, not dramatically, just a loosening, a small unclenching in how the platoon held itself around her. Space made at the table without being asked. A nod here, a question there that wasn't a test anymore, just conversation. Fenwick found her, looking sheepish and grateful in equal measure, a plate of something beige balanced in his hands. Thanks, Doc. He sat down across from her without waiting for an invitation. Corpsman at the aid station said I was maybe 5 minutes from seizing out completely. Said you probably saved my life. You're welcome. Drink more water tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day until we're out of this desert. Yes, ma'am. A beat. He was working up to something. She could see it in the way his eyes kept sliding toward her in a way. Can I ask you something? You're going to anyway. A small laugh surprised out of him. You seem like you really know your stuff, Doc. Not just the classroom kind. Were you deployed somewhere before this? Somewhere real? She looked down at her tray. Cut something that didn't need cutting, just to give her hands something to do that wasn't answering. I've been around, Fenwick. He let it go, young enough still to accept a non-answer as an answer. But 2 tables over, Marsh had been listening the whole time. Those quiet gray eyes tracking every small detail she couldn't quite manage to hide, assembling something out of the pieces the way a man assembles a rifle in the dark by feel, by memory, by knowing exactly what shape the finished thing was supposed to take. The armory sat at the northeast corner of the compound, a squat concrete building with a single steel door and a padlock that had probably been replaced a dozen times over the base's history, and never once actually tested. Nobody expected it to be tested that night. Emery was crossing back from the medical tent past 9, restocking supplies for the next morning's sick call when she heard it, a sound wrong enough to stop her mid-stride. Metal on metal. Not the ordinary metal on metal of a base at night, not a Humvee door, not a rifle sling against a plate carrier. This was quieter, deliberate, the sound of someone trying very hard not to be heard. She stood very still in the dark and listened, and every year of training she'd spent trying to bury came rushing back up through her chest all at once, because there was a difference between a sound that belonged and a sound that didn't. She'd learned that difference in places with names that didn't appear on any map issued to the public, and her body knew it even when her mind was still catching up. She didn't call out, didn't run for help. Some old instinct, the kind that had kept her alive more than once, told her that calling out now would only cost her the element of she didn't even know what yet. She moved instead, low, quiet, along the shadow line of the supply row toward the armory's east wall. A figure, crouched at the base of the door, working something against the padlock hasp with quick, practiced hands. Not a drill. She knew that in her body before her mind finished the thought. Drills had a rhythm to them, a performance quality, even when they were meant to feel real. This had none of that. This had the flat, economical quality of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. Her radio was on her hip. She could have keyed it, should have. Instead, her hand found the grip of the side arm at her thigh, and her body dropped into a stance she hadn't consciously used in years, weight balanced, breathing slowed without her telling it to, every muscle arranging itself according to a blueprint she'd sworn she'd stopped consulting. Hands. Her voice came out flat, controlled, nothing in it that belonged to a corpsman. Now, the figure spun, a civilian jacket, dark, nondescript, a face half lit by the security lamp at the corner of the building, young, startled, and afraid in a way that told her more than any interrogation could have. Not a professional. A local kid, probably paid, probably in over his head and only now understanding exactly how far over. He bolted. She didn't chase. Instead, her hand came up, radio to her mouth in one motion so practiced it felt like something her body did without consulting her at all. Armory breach, northeast wall. Suspect fleeing on foot, heading toward the fence line. Small build, dark jacket, unarmed as far as I can tell. Requesting response. Static. Then Coleman's voice, sharp with adrenaline. Doc, say again, you got eyes on him? Negative, he's clear of my position, moving northeast. Boots hit the ground running within 90 seconds. The base came alive around her. Floodlights snapping on, engines turning over, the whole machine of the place lurching into motion. She stood where she was, sidearm still in her hand, heart rate exactly where it should have been, which was low, which was controlled, which was wrong for a corpsman who'd just watched a possible intrusion at a weapons depot and somehow felt nothing but a very old, very quiet click of recognition. Marsh reached her first, took one look at her stance, at the sidearm still steady in her grip, at the flat calm on her face that had no business belonging to someone 5 days into a posting. You called it in clean, he said slowly. Range, direction, description. In under 10 seconds. Training, gunny. That's not corpsman training, Doc. His gray eyes didn't leave her face. "That's operator training." She didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer that didn't open a door she'd spent years keeping shut. And some part of her, the part that had spent 5 days proving herself inch by inch, hour by hour, sweat by sweat, understood that the door had just cracked open anyway, whether she'd meant it to or not. They never caught the kid. He vanished through a gap in the perimeter fence that maintenance would find and patch by morning, and the incident got logged as a probable local opportunist. Low threat, no further action required. But Marsh didn't file it away that easily. She could see it in the careful way he watched her the rest of that night, the way his eyes tracked the set of her shoulders, the balance of her weight, all the small physical tells that a body carries when it's been built for something other than bandages. She lay awake a long time that night, staring at canvas gone dark above her cot, listening to the wind pick at the tent walls, feeling the old shape of herself pressing up against the shape she'd been trying to become. Because she'd promised. She'd stood at a grave in Montana with dirt still fresh on the ground and promised her mother, promised herself, that this part of her, the part that moved without hesitation, that read a threat in 3 seconds and answered it before fear even had the chance to register, was done. Retired. Buried alongside the man who'd built it into her one Montana weekend at a time. Except it wasn't buried. It had just been waiting. She didn't sleep well. Bannerman requested her file the next morning. Not through any official channel. Those had already delivered him the standard packet, thin and mostly black with redaction, the kind of file that told a careful reader more by what it withheld than by what it revealed. He requested a deeper pull, the kind that took time, kind that required calling in favors from people who owed him from other postings, other decades, other wars. He sat in his office, a converted shipping container, with a desk, 2 chairs, and a fan that fought a losing battle against the heat, and waited for it to come through on a secure terminal that hummed louder than the fan did. It took most of the morning. When it finally populated, he read it twice before he let himself believe what he was looking at. Callaway, Emory J. Prior service record scrubbed down to skeleton entries, attachment to units whose names existed only as abbreviations that didn't map to anything in the standard directory. Commendations without citations explaining what they were for. A gap of nearly 3 years where the file simply went dark, replaced by a single administrative line, assignment classified above requesting clearance, and under family information, buried where routine personnel data usually lived. A name that stopped his breath somewhere in the middle of his chest. Father, Callaway, Colter, United States Navy. Deceased. He knew that name. He'd known that name for 25 years, had carried it the way a man carries a stone in his boot. Small and constant and impossible to walk without feeling. Because it hadn't just been a name in a file back then. It had been a man he'd served beside. A line buried in an old operational cross-reference, flagged and then flagged again by whatever system had compiled this. A joint operation. Border interdiction. 5 years back. Multiple casualties. One name among them that hit him like a physical blow, because he had been there. He had been on that operation, had walked away from it whole while better men hadn't, and he had spent 5 years quietly, privately, never once speaking it aloud, wondering if there had been something he could have done differently in those final minutes that might have changed how it ended. He'd known Colter Callaway only that one night, really. A handful of hours in the dark that had rearranged everything Bannerman believed about what a person could give another person under fire. And then Callaway hadn't come home from it, and Bannerman had, and the arithmetic of that had never once balanced out in the 5 years since. And now his daughter was standing in formation on this base every morning, 27 years old, 118 pounds, moving through a firefight if last night's incident even qualified, as one with the same terrifying stillness Bannerman remembered from a man he'd watched hold a collapsing perimeter together with nothing but his voice in his hands. He sat with that for a long time. Long enough that the light through the container's small window shifted from white to gold without his noticing. Colter Callaway, killed in action. The same operation. The same night. The same darkness Bannerman still sometimes woke from, with his hands shaking before he remembered he was safe, remembered he was old now, remembered that some debts didn't come due all at once. They just waited, patient as stone, until the day they did. He closed the file, sat very still, because he understood, in that moment, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the young woman standing in formation outside his window wasn't just a gifted corpsman with a mysterious past. She was a debt he hadn't known he still owed, walking around his base in desert fatigues, and she had no idea yet what she was standing next to. He would have to decide, soon, whether to tell her. He found her that evening outside the medical tent, restocking for the following day with the same obsessive precision she brought to everything. She heard him coming, heard the particular weight of his footsteps, the hesitation in them that didn't match the confidence he usually carried, and looked up before he'd said a word. "Sir, Calloway." He stood there a moment, hands loose at his sides, looking like a man who'd rehearsed something and then lost every word of it the second it mattered. "Walk with me." She fell in beside him without question. They moved between the rows of tents, past the motor pool, out toward the edge of the compound where the fence line met open desert, and the noise of the base fell away behind them. "Your file's mostly black," he said finally. "I know, sir. I pulled a deeper version this morning." Something in her went very still. Not visibly, just a stillness under the surface, the kind only someone looking for it would notice. "Sir, your father." He stopped walking, turned to face her, and in the fading light his face looked older than she'd seen it, older than 52, older than the job should have made a man who still had years left in him. Coulter Calloway. The name hung in the air between them like something with weight, like something that could fall and crack the ground. "Yes, sir. I knew him." 2 words. Simple words. And yet she watched them land on her like a physical thing, watched something in her posture shift, brace, the way a person braces before a wave that hasn't arrived yet but is close enough to hear. "You knew my father." 5 years ago. A joint operation, border interdiction, multiple units. His voice had gone very quiet now, quiet in a way that made the desert around them feel enormous and close at the same time. "I was there. Your father was leading the element beside mine." She said nothing, just watched him, waiting, the way she'd learned to wait through years of situations where the wrong word at the wrong moment could cost more than silence ever would. "I only knew him that one night," Bannerman said. "A few hours. But I've spent 5 years thinking about those hours more than I've thought about almost anything else in my life." He looked past her, out at the darkening flats, at nothing in particular. He held a line that should have collapsed twice over. "Kept people alive who had no business staying alive. Including me." "That sounds like him," she said quietly, something warm moving under the grief in her voice. He didn't talk about the hard nights. He just showed up for them. Something almost like a laugh escaped Bannerman, broken at the edges. "There's more, Calloway." She waited, felt the ground under the conversation shift, felt it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm actually breaks. Her breath caught. She didn't mean for it to. It happened anyway, involuntary. A small catch in her chest that she couldn't have stopped if she'd tried. "You were there," she repeated. Barely a whisper. "I walked out of that night whole." He met her eyes then, and whatever else he was, whatever rank he carried, whatever command sat on his shoulders in that moment, he looked like a man setting down something he'd been carrying alone for a very long time. "Your father didn't." The desert around them went very quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold itself still, waiting to see what she'd do with what she'd just been handed. She didn't cry. Hadn't cried about this in a long time. Had learned somewhere in the years since the funeral how to let grief move through her like weather, instead of like a wound that reopened every time someone touched it. But an old ache had surfaced, tight and unfamiliar, something she'd believed buried deep enough to leave alone for good. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she said finally. "You've had my file for 5 days." "Because I didn't know how." He looked, in that moment, younger than 52, younger than the uniform, younger than the command. "Because I've carried that night for 5 years without saying his name out loud to another living person. And then you walked into my platoon, and He stopped, started again. "I don't know what to say to you, Calloway. I don't know what a man says to the daughter of the person he owes his life to." She looked at him for a long moment, at the weight sitting behind his eyes, the guilt worn thin and permanent as a scar. "You don't have to say anything, sir." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "He wouldn't have wanted you carrying it like this." "How do you know what he would have wanted?" "Because I knew him." Something flickered across her face, gone almost before it arrived. Better than his file. Better than his call sign. "I knew him." Bannerman nodded slowly, didn't push further. But something had shifted between them in that stretch of quiet desert. Some door cracked open on both sides at once, and neither of them fully understood yet what would come through it. "This doesn't leave this conversation," he said finally. "Not yet. Not until you're ready for it to." "Yes, sir." He turned to walk back toward the compound, then stopped, looked back at her one more time. "For what it's worth, Calloway." His voice had gone rough again. "You move like him. I saw it last night at the armory. I didn't want to believe it, but I saw it." He left her standing there in the near dark, at the edge of the fence line, with the whole weight of the desert pressing in around her and a truth she hadn't asked for settling into her chest like something with its own gravity. She called her mother that night from the small satellite phone she kept tucked in the bottom of her ruck, wrapped in a plastic bag to keep the sand out. Montana was 2 hours behind. Early evening there. Her mother would be moving through the routines that had carried her through 5 years of widowhood dinner, the porch light, the particular silence of a house built for 3 people that now held only one. The call connected on the 3rd ring. Emery. Marlo Calloway's voice, warm and instantly worried, the way it always was now, the way it had been ever since. "Honey, everything okay?" "I'm fine, Mom." A pause. Longer than she meant it to be. "Just wanted to hear your voice. You sound tired. It's hot here." Her mother was quiet a moment. Emery could picture her exactly standing at the kitchen counter, phone pressed to her ear, looking out the window at the mountains that had raised both of them in their own different ways. "You're not telling me something." Emery closed her eyes. Because her mother had always been able to hear the things underneath the things, had learned that skill the hard way, in a marriage to a man who spent half his life somewhere he couldn't talk about. "I met someone today who knew Dad." The silence on the line changed texture. Went careful. "Who?" "My commanding officer." She kept her voice level, the way she'd learned to keep it level through years of delivering news nobody wanted to hear. "He was there, Mom, that night. He made it out. Dad didn't." She heard her mother's breath catch, heard the small sound of a chair being pulled out, sat in, the sound of a body needing somewhere to be steady. "Oh," her mother said softly, "just that." Just the one small word carrying 5 years of grief inside it. "He's carrying it, Mom. Guilt. I could see it on him. That's not your burden to fix, Emery." "I know. Do you?" Her mother's voice sharpened, just slightly, just enough to carry the old fear underneath it, the fear that never fully went away. "Because I know you. I know what it looks like when you decide something is your job to carry. And I need you to hear me when I say this isn't. None of this is." "I hear you, Mom. Promise me you're not going back to who you were. Promise me this is just medicine. Just the bandages and the IVs and none of the rest of it." Emery looked out at the dark shape of the fence line, at the desert beyond it, stretching out toward a horizon she couldn't see anymore, thinking of the armory, of the stance her body had dropped into without asking permission, of the flat, calm certainty that had moved through her before fear even had a chance to arrive. "I promise, Mom." The words came out smooth, practiced. She almost believed them herself. "Just medicine." "I love you," her mother said. "I need you to come home to me. Both of you isn't a possibility I get to have anymore. I only get you now. I love you too, Mom. I'll be careful." They talked a few more minutes about small things. The ranch, the weather rolling in off the mountains, a neighbor's new foal, a fence that needed mending, the ordinary anchors of a life that had nothing to do with deserts or files or dead men whose voices still followed their daughters into rooms 25 years after they'd spoken. Then they said goodnight, and Emery sat alone in the dark of her tent with the phone still warm in her hand, and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of everything the day had handed her. Her father's ghost, walking these grounds in a way she hadn't expected. Her commanding officer, carrying guilt for a death he hadn't caused. And underneath all of it, quiet and patient and unmistakably present, the old shape of herself, the one she'd promised to leave, buried stirring awake again, 1 inch at a time, the way something always does when it's needed and can feel itself being needed, whether the person carrying it wants it awake or not. She lay back on her cot, stared up at canvas gone black in the desert night. Somewhere out past the fence line, wind moved across sand that had swallowed better men than her without ever once slowing down to notice. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow would come the way it always did, whether she was ready for it or not. Somewhere down the row of tents, a generator kicked on with a low mechanical groan, and the ordinary sound of the bass settling into another night moved on without her. indifferent to everything that had shifted in the hours since sundown. She let it carry her toward sleep anyway, one breath at a time, 4 counts in and 7 held and 8 out, the only prayer she still fully trusted. The intel came in on a Tuesday, though days had stopped meaning much to Emery by then. Out here they were just numbers, just markers between one shift and the next. And this one arrived stapled to a manila folder that Bannerman set down on the briefing table like it weighed more than paper should. Satellite imagery. Grainy gray, the kind of photograph that turned a building into a rumor. A compound 40 miles south, tucked into a fold of land where the border blurred into something the maps didn't quite agree on. Weapons cache, Bannerman said. No preamble. He wasn't a man who wasted mornings on preamble. Confirmed by 2 independent sources. Volume suggests it's not local, which means somebody's moving military-grade hardware through a corridor that shouldn't exist. Coleman leaned forward. Local cartel operation? That's the question. Bannerman's mouth pressed into a flat line. Answers looking like no. He clicked to the next image, a logo. Small, easy to miss, stenciled faint along the side of a shipping crate half buried under tarp. Corv Dynamics. Emery didn't recognize the name. Held on to it anyway, the way she held on to everything, because names had a habit of coming back around when you least expected them to matter. Private contractor, Marsh said slowly, reading off his own tablet. Defense manufacturing, government contracts going back a decade. Clean on paper. Nothing's ever clean on paper, Bannerman said. That's what paper's for. He looked up, found Emery in the back row without seeming to look for her, the way he always did now, ever since the fence line, ever since the 2 words that had cracked something open between them that neither of them had closed back up. We're running reconnaissance. Confirm the cache, confirm the players, gather what we can without engaging. If it's what it looks like, this goes above our pay grade fast. Fenwick raised his hand, young enough still to think briefings were a place for questions. And if it's not clean, sir? If somebody's feeding weapons through here that shouldn't be in civilian hands? Bannerman's face didn't change, but something moved behind it. Something old and tired that had learned, a long time ago, exactly how deep these kinds of roots could go before anyone found the bottom of them. Then we do our job, he said, and let the people whose job it is to worry about the rest of it, worry about the rest of it. Emery watched him say it, watched the small crack in his certainty, there and gone so fast most of the room wouldn't have caught it. She caught it. She'd gotten good at catching things like that. They rolled out 2 nights later. 2 vehicles, engines idling low in the dark, headlights off, running on night vision the way her father used to describe it, the world reduced to green and black, and the particular silence of men who'd stopped talking an hour before departure, because talking was for people who hadn't done this before. Emery sat in the second vehicle, medical bag between her boots, rifle across her lap, the same standard issue M4 she'd carried every day since arriving, unfired in anger, cleaned and maintained, the way professionals maintained things they hoped never to need, because that was the promise. Because a rifle you kept clean and never used was still keeping a promise, technically, even if the keeping felt thinner every single day she carried it. Coleman drove. Fenwick rode shotgun, quieter than usual, the particular quiet of a young man trying very hard to look like he wasn't nervous. Marsh sat across from her in the back, gray eyes catching hers once in the dark, and holding there just long enough to say something neither of them needed words for. 40 miles. 90 minutes over ground that didn't believe in roads. Nobody spoke. The desert at night wasn't empty. It only looked that way. Underneath the silence ran a whole conversation of small sounds engine, tires on gravel, the metal creak of gear shifting against gear, and underneath that ran something else entirely. A tension that had no sound at all, just weight. Just the particular pressure of a place that knew something was about to happen before the people driving through it did. They stopped 2 clicks out. Dismounted without being told to, the way a team moves when it's done this enough times that instruction has become unnecessary. Bannerman's voice low over the radio. Alpha. Proceed to overwatch. Bravo, hold position. Charlie a pause, and she felt it land on her even before her named it Calloway. You're with Charlie. Stay back. Stay ready. Copy, she said, and the word came out steadier than the thing sitting behind her ribs. They moved forward in the dark. Green shapes against a black landscape. 10 men and 1 woman who wasn't supposed to need to be anything other than a corpsman tonight. She almost believed that herself. For about 11 more minutes. The compound sat low against a ridge, walls the color of old bone in the green wash of her night vision. Alpha Team had eyes on it from 200 meters, radioing back head counts, crate counts, the slow mechanical language of men building a picture out of shadows. Multiple hostiles on the perimeter, Marsh's voice, quiet static. 6 visible. Could be more inside. Bannerman from somewhere closer to the ridgeline. Copy. Hold. We're here to confirm, not engage. Emery crouched with the rest of Charlie Element behind a low rise of scrub and stone, medical bag open at her side, everything laid out the way it always was, the way it had to be, because chaos didn't wait for you to find the right pouch. Because this was the part where her body always went very still, very quiet. A held breath stretched out over minutes instead of seconds, which was exactly when the ground under Alpha Team's position turned into fire. The flash came first, a white tear across the darkness that her night vision couldn't process fast enough, blooming into something enormous, something with sound arriving a half-second behind it, like the world hadn't decided yet whether it was really happening. The boom rolled over the desert and through her chest at the same time. IED hit. The radio dissolved into chaos, voices overlapping, gunfire cracking sharp and close, deep stutter of something automatic, answering something else automatic, and underneath all of it, Bannerman's voice, tight, controlled, trying to hold a shape onto something that had already lost its shape. 2 down, I need Doc. Coleman grabbed for the radio. Started to say something about orders, about staying back, about the plan that had existed 40 seconds ago and no longer applied to anything. Emery was already moving. She didn't decide to. That was the thing nobody understood. About moments like this, there was no decision, no weighing, no careful calculation of promise against necessity. There was only the sound of men dying 200 meters away and a body that had been built, deliberately, patiently, over years of Montana weekends, to answer that sound before anything else in her had the chance to argue. Doc! Coleman's voice behind her, sharp with fear that had nothing to do with cowardice. Command said hold. She didn't stop. Couldn't. Wouldn't have even if some part of her mind had managed to form the thought in time, which it hadn't, because thought was already 3 steps behind her boots. 70 pounds of gear. Full sprint through sand that dragged at every stride like it was trying to keep her from what was coming. The gunfire got louder as she closed the distance, closer, until it stopped being sound and started being something she could feel in her teeth. She found them behind a collapsed section of wall. 2 Marines down. Muzzle flashes stitching the darkness all around, rounds sparking off stone close enough that she felt the heat of them pass. Trerage. Instant. Automatic. The training underneath everything else she'd built herself out of since. First man. Chest wound. Blood bubbling with every ragged breath. The wet, terrible sound of a lung that had given up doing its job. Tension pneumothorax. 2 minutes, maybe less. Before his heart stopped from pressure it couldn't fight anymore. She had the needle in before her mind caught up to her hands. Second intercostal space. The same spot she'd taught the platoon on her 3rd day. The spot she could find blind, in the dark, under fire, because some things lived in muscle instead of memory. The rush of air came. His breathing eased almost instantly. Marsh. She didn't look up. Chest seal now. His hands were there before she'd finished the sentence, steady despite everything falling apart around them. Second Marine. Leg wound femoral, dark blood pumping out around a tourniquet that had been applied too loose, too late, by hands that hadn't had the seconds to do it right. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, pressed down with both palms, counted through the longest 3 minutes of her life while the world came apart in gunfire all around her. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. Stable, she said into her radio, breath ragged, hands slick. 1 decompressed, 1 hemorrhage controlled. I need medevac. That was when she saw him. 400 meters out. A ridge above the compound, a silhouette against stars too bright for a night that had gone this wrong. A man. A rifle. Not a rifle like the ones cracking off automatic fire all around her, something longer. Something built for a single purpose, a single distance, a single kind of certainty. And it was tracking, slow, patient, toward the outcropping where Bannerman had taken cover to direct the fight. Her mind split cleanly in 2, because there was the corpsman, the one who'd spent 5 days proving she belonged in a uniform that fit her the way a promise fits a person, snug, deliberate, worn on purpose. And there was the other thing, The thing underneath. The thing that had gone quiet for 8 years but never once, not for a single day, forgotten how to read wind, how to read distance, how to read a man's shoulders and know exactly what he was about to do before he did it. 8-mile-per-hour wind, east, 400 meters, 15 degrees of elevation. The numbers arrived without her asking for them. That was the worst part. That was the part that frightened her more than the gunfire did, that some part of her had never actually stopped doing this math, had just been doing it quietly, in the dark, waiting. Her eyes found the Barrett lying beside the wounded Marine. 30 pounds of matte black steel that nobody out here had ordered her to touch. Her hand closed around the grip before the argument in her head finished forming. Because Mom. Because the grave. Because the words she'd said with dirt still fresh under her boots. No more rifles. No more killing. Just medicine. Just saving lives. Be safe. Come home. Because she had meant every single syllable of that promise the day she made it. Except there was a man on a ridge 400 meters out with a rifle pointed at Holt Bannerman's skull, and Bannerman didn't know it yet. And in 3 seconds it wouldn't matter what she'd promised anyone, because he would already be dead. She lifted the rifle. 8 years since she'd done this. 8 years since she'd sworn she never would again. Muscle memory didn't care about promises. Muscle memory just remembered. Prone. Bipod down. Cheek to stock, eye to scope, the world narrowing to a small green circle that contained exactly one thing that mattered. Down, she screamed, and didn't wait to see if he heard her. The Barrett roared. The kick punched into her shoulder like something with a grudge. The shot went high, wide, missed the sniper by 10 feet, and sparked off the ridge behind him, close enough to spray him with rock, close enough to make him flinch and swing his rifle toward the new threat that had just announced itself. Too close, too slow. Her hands hadn't forgiven 8 years of rust in the space of one shot. She cycled the bolt, chambered again, found him in the scope, his rifle already tracking toward her position, toward the muzzle flash she'd just handed him for free. Her father's voice arrived out of somewhere she hadn't given it permission to come from. Breathe in. 4 counts. Hold. 7. Aim small, miss small, sweetheart. She corrected the wind. 9 miles an hour, not 8. She'd misjudged it. And the correction came automatic, came the way it always used to come, like her body had never actually let go of any of it, had just been carrying it quietly this whole time, waiting to be needed. Squeeze, don't pull. The Barrett spoke a second time. The sniper fell, dropped his rifle, tumbled off the ridge and out of sight, and for 3 full heartbeats nothing in the entire desert moved. Then the world came rushing back in gunfire, radio chatter. Marcia's voice shouting something she couldn't parse yet, and Emery lowered the rifle with hands that had started, finally, to shake. The compound fell quiet within the hour. Alpha and Bravo secured the perimeter, confirmed no additional hostiles, called in the ordnance team to deal with what remained of the cache. Medevac came for the 2 wounded Marines and left again into the dark, rotors beating the desert into a kind of temporary submission. Emery knelt in the sand beside the Barrett, hands still trembling, and became aware slowly that every single Marine within sight was staring at her, not at the wounded, not at the compound, at her. Bannerman crossed the distance between them like a man walking through water. His face had gone the color of old paper, his mouth open around words that hadn't found their way out yet. Calloway. His voice came out rough, barely a whisper. That casualties are stable, sir. She kept her voice level, the same clinical calm she used for every emergency, because if she let it slip even an inch, she wasn't sure what would come out instead. Request permission to move them for extraction. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Coleman found his voice first, and it came out cracked down the middle. What in the hell was that? She stood, picked up her medical bag, because her hands needed something ordinary to hold on to. Doc. Marcia's voice, quieter than Coleman's, rougher underneath it. Where'd you learn to shoot like that? She looked at him, at all of them, at the ring of faces lit green and gray by the last of the night vision, waiting for an answer that would either make sense of the last 5 minutes or shatter every assumption they'd built about her since she arrived. She was tired of hiding a truth that had just saved a man's life in front of a dozen witnesses. My father taught me, she said, and her voice carried clean across the silence. Coulter Calloway, Navy SEAL. Call sign Wraith. The name landed like a second explosion. Bannerman's face went from pale to something closer to gray. His hands, she noticed, had started to shake at his sides. "Wraith," he said. Not a question. A word he'd been carrying so long it had worn smooth in his mouth like a stone. "Your father was Wraith?" "Yes, sir. He was your father." Bannerman's voice cracked on the last word. "And you just—" He gestured helplessly at the ridge, at the Barrett, at 400 meters of impossible darkness she'd just reached across twice in a row. "You just saved my life." Same as he did. 25 years and 5 years, and now you, standing here, having done it again. The desert held its silence around the two of them while every Marine present understood, all at once, that they had just watched something much larger than a single well-placed shot. They didn't talk about it on the ride back. Couldn't. Really, the kind of thing that had just happened didn't fit into conversation. Not yet. Not while the adrenaline was still working its way out of everyone's blood. Emery sat with her back against the Humvee's frame, Barrett across her knees, watching the desert slide by gray and formless through the window, and let herself feel, finally, the full weight of what she'd just done. 8 years. Broken in under 30 seconds. Because a promise wasn't a wall, she was learning. It was more like a dam. It held and held and held, right up until the moment it didn't, and then everything behind it came through all at once, and there was no putting any of it back. She didn't cry, didn't let herself, just sat very still and watched the dark roll past and waited for morning, because morning always came whether you were ready for it or not, and she'd have to be ready, because there was a phone call sitting on the other side of it that she could already feel forming in her chest like a stone. The intelligence team went through the compound at first light, photographs, inventory, the slow, careful documentation of a cache that had turned out to be exactly what it looked like and worse, in ways nobody had fully expected. Bannerman called her into his container office that afternoon. Marsh was already there, standing near the window, arms crossed, a folder open on the desk between 2 chairs. "Sit, Calloway." She sat, waited. "We pulled everything off the man you shot." Bannerman's voice had steadied since the night before, but something underneath it hadn't, something that still trembled at the edges when he let it. "ID, comms gear, a burner phone with call logs going back months. We're still working through it, but there's a name in there." He paused. "You need to hear this sitting down, and you already are, so." "Sir, the identification's still preliminary," Marsh cut in, careful. "Local contractor, low level, no formal military record we can find yet, but his comms logs tie him directly to Corpsman Dynamics payroll. Whoever he wasn't acting alone, and he wasn't the one calling the shots on this." Emery felt the tension in her ease, just slightly, and then pull taut again just as fast. A stranger. Not a name from her father's past, not yet, but a thread leading somewhere she suspected would eventually reach one. "There's a second name that keeps surfacing in the financial trail," Bannerman said. "Someone Corpsman keeps on retainer for what their internal paperwork calls field security consulting. We don't have him confirmed on site last night, but everything about the operation has his signature, according to people who've crossed his path before." "Who?" Emery asked. "Silas Draven." Bannerman said the name slowly, watching her face. "Ex-military. Quiet discharge, the kind that doesn't come with details attached. We're pulling his full record now." Marsh slid a photograph across the desk. Grainy, long lens, a man's face half turned from the camera. "We're cross-referencing his service history against operational records. It's going to take time. But given what we found last night, given what this cache represents, I don't think he's a stranger to this corridor. I think he's been running it for a while." Emery studied the photograph a long moment. Something in her chest recognized nothing about the face and everything about the shape of what it meant. "If he's real," she said slowly, "and if he's been running weapons through this border for years, how far back does that go?" Nobody answered right away. The fan in the corner of the office turned uselessly, pushing hot air from one side of the room to the other. "I don't know yet," Bannerman said finally, "but I intend to find out." Marsh cleared his throat. "There's more." Emery looked up. "The weapons in that cache." Marsh slid a second photograph across the desk. Crates, stenciled logos. The same faint mark she'd seen in the briefing 2 nights before. Corpsman Dynamics doesn't manufacture this hardware for civilian trafficking. Somebody inside their supply chain is moving it there deliberately, and moving it this cleanly, this consistently, across a border this well-watched, requires help, Emery finished. From somebody who knows exactly where the watching isn't happening. Requires somebody on the inside, Bannerman said. Ours, or close enough to ours that it doesn't matter which. The three of them sat with that for a long moment. Sir, Emery's voice came out steadier than she felt. If there's a leak feeding logistics to Corvid Dynamics supply schedules, patrol routes, positioning, that's how they knew where to hit us last night. That's not luck. That's information. Bannerman's face had gone hard in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not anger, exactly. Something colder than anger. The particular stillness of a man realizing the danger sitting closest to him might be wearing a familiar face. I know, he said. And until I know whose face it is, Calloway, I need you to trust exactly nobody outside this room. Not until we find it. The surviving contractor from the compound raid, a wiry man in his 30s who'd surrendered rather than run when Bravo team closed the perimeter, sat across a folding table from Reyes the following morning, hands zip-tied, eyes darting between the federal agent and the two Marines flanking the door. Bannerman had allowed Emery to observe from the corner, silent, unacknowledged, on the condition that she said nothing unless spoken to. You're not looking at federal weapons charges if you talk to me, Reyes said, voice even, unhurried. You're looking at them if you don't. That's the whole negotiation. I'm not going to dress it up. The man's mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no words came for a long moment, his eyes fixed somewhere past Reyes's shoulder, like the answer might be easier to give to an empty wall than to a federal agent's face. Who hired the crew, Reyes said. Not the company name off a shipping crate. A person. Someone who told you where to be and when. Guy handles logistics for Corvid's field contracts. The man's voice came out thin, reluctant. Never met him in person. Everything came through a cutout. Encrypted messages, burner phones, cash drops at a gas station outside Deming. Name. Nobody uses names in this business. You use names, you're already dead. He glanced toward the door, toward the Marines standing there, and something in his posture folded a little further. There's a guy who shows up when things go wrong. When somebody talks too much, or asks too many questions, or gets in the way of a shipment. Quiet. Professional. The kind of guy you don't want finding your address. Description. Tall. Lean. Moves like he's done this his whole life, 'cause he probably has. The man's eyes flicked to Emery in the corner, back to Reyes. He wasn't with us last night. But he's the reason nobody in this operation ever skims a nickel or misses a drop-off deadline. Everybody's scared of him. I mean everybody. Reyes made a note. Didn't look up. Would you recognize a photograph? Maybe, if it's recent. A pause. You said I'm not looking at the worst of it if I cooperate. I want that in writing before I say anything else. Reyes closed the laptop halfway, considering. I can get you that. But you need to understand something first. If the man you're describing is who I think he is, cooperating with us is the safer option, by a wide margin, compared to what happens if he ever finds out you talked, and I didn't have you somewhere he couldn't reach. The contractor's face went pale under its sunburn. Emery watched from her corner, filing away every detail without quite meaning to the fear in the man's posture. The particular shape of a threat large enough to make a hardened trafficker's hands shake at the mention of it. Whoever this was, he'd built a reputation that traveled ahead of him like weather. Afterward, walking back across the compound with Marsh, she said what she'd been turning over since the interrogation room. He wasn't on site last night, which means whoever I hit on that ridge wasn't the one they're all afraid of. No, Marsh agreed, which means the real problem's still out there, watching, deciding what happens next. That's not a comforting thought, Gunny. Wasn't meant to be, Doc. He glanced at her sideways. But better to know it now than find out the hard way later. That night the platoon gathered around her in the chow hall with a different kind of silence than she'd known before. Not suspicion anymore. Something closer to reverence, which felt, if anything, harder to sit inside of. Fenwick found her first, tray in hand, sliding into the seat across from her with none of his usual easy chatter. Doc. He hesitated. Is it true, what they're saying about your dad? It's true, Fenwick. He absorbed that for a moment, turning something over behind his young face. You could have told us. Would it have changed how you looked at me? He didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. Yeah, he admitted finally, probably, and he shook his head, embarrassed. That's on us, I guess. Not you. Coleman approached more slowly, dropped into the seat beside Fenwick, studied her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't quite name. You saved the colonel's life, he said finally. Twice if you count what happened at the armory as a preview. I did my job. No. His voice was quiet but firm. Your job is bandages, Doc. What you did last night was something else. Something most operators train their whole careers for, and never actually get right under pressure. He shook his head slowly. You've been carrying that this whole time. Every day. Standing next to us in formation. I made a promise, she said. Simple. Flat. The only explanation she had that felt honest enough to say out loud. To my mother. After my father died. No more of that life. Just medicine. And last night, she looked down at her hands. Still faintly stained, she noticed, from work she hadn't fully scrubbed away. Last night I broke it, she said. Because the alternative was watching your colonel die on a ridge 400 meters away, while I stood there remembering a promise instead of using what I know. Nobody said anything for a while after that. The chow hall noise moved around them, ordinary and distant, like the rest of the world hadn't quite caught up yet to what had happened in the desert the night before. For what it's worth, Marsh said, appearing at the end of the table with his own tray, settling in without asking permission. I don't think your father would have wanted you carrying that promise if it meant watching good men die to keep it. You didn't know him. No, Marsh's gray eyes held hers, steady. But I know men like him. Men who build something like that into their kids don't build it so it sits in a box. They build it because someday the world's going to need it, and they want their kid ready when it does. Emery didn't have an answer for that. Just sat there, surrounded by men who'd looked at her differently 24 hours ago and let herself feel, for the first time since arriving at Camp Ridgeline, something that might have been the beginning of belonging. She called her mother the next morning, before sunrise, sitting on the edge of her cot with the satellite phone cold in her hand, and her stomach already knotted around what she had to say. The call connected on the second ring, which meant her mother had been up already, which meant somehow some part of Marlowe Calloway had known this call was coming before it arrived. Emery. No warmth this time. Just a name, said carefully. The way you'd say a word you were afraid might break if you pressed too hard on it. Mom, you didn't call yesterday. A pause. You always call. Even when you're tired. Even when there's nothing to say. Emery closed her eyes. I had to use the rifle, Mom. The silence on the line stretched out long enough that she almost said her mother's name just to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Tell me, her mother said finally. Very quiet. There was a sniper. On a ridge. He had a shot lined up on my commanding officer, and I was the only one who could stop it. Emery's voice stayed level through sheer force of will. So I stopped it. You killed someone. Yes. Another silence. This one heavier than the last. I know I promised, Emery said into it, because the quiet had become unbearable. I know what I said at the grave. I meant every word of it, Mom, I did. But her mother's voice had gone thin and brittle, the sound of something being held together by will alone. There's always a but with you now, isn't there? Mom, don't. Sharp, immediate. Don't tell me it was necessary. Don't tell me about duty, about the math of it, about how many people would have died if you hadn't. Your father used every one of those words 100 times, Emery. Every single time. And it was always true. That's what made it so much harder to argue with. Emery said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like an excuse dressed up as an explanation. I need you to be careful, her mother said finally. Whatever this is now, whatever it's turning into, I already buried your father because of that place, Emery. I can't do it twice. I know, Mom. Promise me you'll come home. Emery closed her eyes, thought of the ridge, of the Barrett's kick against her shoulder, of Bannerman's face, gray with recognition, and a man falling silent into darkness that had swallowed him whole. I promise, she said, and meant it. The way you mean a promise you already suspect might not survive contact with what's coming. 2 days later, Bannerman called a smaller meeting. Just Emery, Marsh, and a man she didn't recognize, civilian dress, careful posture, the particular blankness of someone who spent his working life not being remembered by strangers. This is Agent Reyes, Bannerman said. Federal. He's been read in on the trafficking angle. Corvid Dynamics has been on a watch list for over a year. What happened at that compound just moved the timeline up considerably. Reyes nodded once, unfolded a laptop, turned the screen toward them. Documents, financial records, a web of shell companies that spread out from Corvid Dynamics like roots under dry soil. We believe Corvid's been running weapons through this corridor for at least 18 months, Reyes said. Small volume, deliberate, careful not to trip alarms. What made your compound different was scale. Somebody got greedy or somebody got desperate, and either way it gave us the first real crack in the wall. And Draven? Emery asked. Contract security. On paper. Reyes's mouth tightened. Off paper, we believe he's been Corvity's enforcement arm for at least that long. Handles anyone who threatens to expose the operation. We suspect at least 2 prior incidents that match his profile, both categorized at the time as unrelated accidents. He wasn't confirmed on site the night of your raid. The man your unit engaged was one of his subordinates. Draven doesn't get his own hands dirty unless the target matters enough to justify it. 5 years ago, Bannerman said quietly. Would that fit his timeline? Was he active then? Reyes hesitated, looked at Emery, then back at Bannerman, weighing something. His service record shows him attached to a logistics support role during that window, he said finally. I can't confirm involvement sitting in this room, but the timeline overlaps, and that concerns me enough to keep pulling the thread. Emery felt the words settle into her chest, like stones dropped into still water, rings spreading outward long after the stone itself had disappeared beneath the surface. There's something else, Reyes continued. And this is the part that concerns us most. He pulled up another document. Personnel records, cross-referenced against supply logs, dates lined up in neat, damning columns. Somebody with access to this base's logistics has been feeding information to Corvid Dynamics. Patrol schedules, convoy routes. The timing of your reconnaissance mission 2 nights ago. The room went very still. You're saying there's someone here, Marsh said slowly, on this base. I'm saying the pattern points that direction. Reyes's voice stayed carefully neutral, the voice of a man who'd learned not to accuse without proof, no matter how strongly the evidence leaned. We don't have a name yet. We have access logs, timing correlations, patterns that don't add up any other way, but we don't have a name. Bannerman's jaw had gone tight, the muscle working once, twice, under skin gone pale. Somebody on my base, he said, very quietly, handed Corvid Dynamics the exact information that put my Marines in that ambush. That got 2 of my men wounded. That nearly got me killed. I want to name Agent Reyes. So do I, Reyes said. Which is why I need everyone in this room to understand something clearly. From this point forward, this investigation stays inside these 4 walls. Nobody outside it. Not your platoon. Not command above you until we're certain who we're dealing with. His eyes moved to Emery, held there a moment. Corvid already knows your name, Corpsman Calloway. After that ridge, they know exactly what you are now, which means whoever's feeding them information already knows it too. Emery felt something cold move through her chest at that. Not fear, exactly. Something more precise than fear. The particular clarity of understanding that the ground under her feet had just gotten considerably less stable. There's a follow-up operation planned, Reyes said. 2 civilian engineers went missing 11 days ago near the border. We believe they stumbled onto part of the trafficking route and were taken to keep them quiet. Corvid's compound network runs deeper than the one you already hit. If we're right, the same organization is holding them. And if Draven is protecting an operation this size, I expect he's the one standing between us and getting them out alive. When? Bannerman said. Soon. Before they're moved somewhere we can't track. Bannerman looked at Emery for a long moment. Something passing behind his eyes that she recognized now, having seen it once before, at the fence line, in the fading light of a conversation that had changed everything between them. Calloway, he said finally, I need to ask you something, and I need you to know you can say no. She already knew what he was going to ask, had known somehow, since the moment Reyes had mentioned Draven's name attached to that timeline, that this was always where the road had been heading. You need a sniper, she said. I need someone who can hold a position at range and keep our people alive while we go in for those hostages. His voice had gone careful, deliberate, a man choosing every word with more weight than usual. I'm not ordering you. This isn't in your job description, and God knows you've already given more than anyone had a right to ask. But I'm asking, as the man whose life you saved, will you do this again? The room went quiet, waiting. Emery thought of her mother's voice on the phone, the plea underneath the anger, the fear that never fully left no matter how carefully either of them tried to bury it. Thought of her father's voice, older, further away, and the particular certainty it had always carried. Thought of 2 engineers somewhere in the dark, waiting to find out whether the world still had room in it for people willing to come get them. "I'll need everything you have on Draven's usual positioning," she said. "Range capabilities. Preferred cover. His patterns." Marsh let out a slow breath, something between relief and grim resolve. Bannerman nodded once. "Then let's get to work." She spent the next 3 days on the range at first light, before the heat made the barrel too hot to touch and the mirage off the sand turned every distant target into a trembling smear. Alone, mostly. Marsh joined her some mornings, spotting scope propped on a bipod beside him, calling wind and correction without ever once asking why 8 years of rust needed shaking off in 72 hours instead of 72 weeks. The first day was humbling. Groups that should have clustered inside 2 inches at 300 yards spread out sloppy and wide, her hands remembering the motions but not yet the certainty underneath them. She worked through it anyway, round after round, resetting, breathing, correcting, the old rhythm returning to her shoulder one flinch at a time. "You're rushing the trigger," Marsh said on the second morning, watching through his spotting scope as another round landed low and left of center. "Not by much." "I know." Then slow down she did. 4 counts in, 7 held, 8 out, the same rhythm her father had drilled into her before she was old enough to understand why a person needed to control something as basic as their own lungs. The next round landed dead center. By the 3rd day, her groups had tightened back down to something that would have made her father proud, and something in her that had spent 8 years insisting this part of herself was gone. For good had gone quiet, resigned, no longer arguing. "Feels different this time," she admitted to Marsh, breaking down her rifle for cleaning, as the sun climbed past the point where shooting was still comfortable. "Before, it was something I did because I had no other options. This time I'm choosing it." "That's the whole difference, Doc." Marsh capped his own weapon case, gray eyes steady on her. "A gift used because you have to isn't the same as a gift used because you decided to. Your father knew that too, I'd guess." "He did." She thought of Montana, of a rifle range that ran out to 1,200 meters, of a man who'd never once made her pull a trigger she didn't choose to pull herself. He always said the choosing was the whole point. That night, alone in her tent, Emery unwrapped the photograph she kept in the bottom of her ruck. 3 people in front of Montana mountains. Her father tall, sun-worn, the kind of presence that filled a photograph the same way he'd filled a room. Her mother beside him, younger, smiling, worry already living quietly behind her eyes even then. And herself 16, rifle across her lap, her father's hand resting light on her shoulder. She traced his face with one finger, the way she always did, when the weight of everything got too heavy to carry alone. "I don't know if I'm doing this right, Dad," she whispered into the dark of the tent. "I don't know if breaking it once was the exception or if I just broke it, period. No going back from here." The tent offered no answer. It never did. But somewhere underneath the silence, she thought she could almost hear him anyway, steady, certain, the way he'd always sounded, standing behind her at the Montana range, watching her line up a shot she didn't yet believe she could make. "Precision saves lives, sweetheart. However you choose to use it." She folded the photograph carefully, put it away, began checking her gear with the same obsessive precision she brought to everything. Because tomorrow the desert would ask something of her again. And this time she intended to be ready for every part of what it took, whatever else came next, whoever was feeding her position to the people hunting her, whatever waited for her on the next ridgeline, she would meet it with both hands. Her mother's fear in one, her father's certainty in the other. She was beginning to understand the only way she'd ever really known how to carry anything that mattered. Outside, the desert had gone fully dark, the kind of dark that swallowed the fence line in the motor pool and every other ordinary marker of the base, until nothing remained but stars and the low hum of a generator somewhere past the medical tent. Emery lay back on her cot and let her eyes adjust to it, thinking of a ranch in Montana under that same sky, of a girl who used to fall asleep counting constellations instead of casualties, of a father who'd taught her both, without ever once explaining that someday she might need to use them on the same night. Tomorrow she would learn everything there was to know about a man named Silas Draven, his patterns, his positioning, the shape of the danger he carried into every room he entered. Tonight, she allowed herself one last hour of simply being a daughter, missing a father, Loving a mother she'd frightened badly enough that the fear still lived in every phone call between them. She closed her eyes. Somewhere out past the wire, the desert kept its own quiet counsel, patient as it had always been and would likely always be, waiting to see exactly what she'd choose to bring to it next. Tomorrow, the terrain briefing. The day after, whatever came for Draven's true face. Whatever came for the leak still hiding somewhere inside walls she'd started to trust. She let the uncertainty sit there beside her instead of fighting it, because fighting it had never once made an unknown outcome any less unknown, and her father had taught her that particular lesson before he'd taught her almost anything else. Sleep found her eventually, thin and careful, the kind of rest a body learns to take when it can't afford to take more. The rifle arrived wrapped in a weatherproof case that had clearly not been opened in years. Marsh set it on the table between them without a word first. Just set it down. Let the weight of it speak before he did. Found this in supply storage this morning. His voice had gone rough at the edges, buried behind 3 crates of nothing. Almost missed it. Emery looked at the case, at the name stenciled along the side in letters gone faint with time. GSGTC, Callaway. SEAL Team. Her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs and stayed there. That's yeah. Marsh nodded once, didn't need her to finish the sentence. Shipped home with his personal effects 5 years ago. Nobody knew what to do with it, so it sat. She reached out, unlatched it slow, like something inside might still be breathing. A Remington 700. Custom stock, dark walnut gone smooth with handling. Match-grade barrel that still smelled faintly of oil somebody had bothered to apply even after the man who owned it stopped needing it kept clean. And carved into the forestock, small enough you had to look close to find it. Little Wraith. Her hands went unsteady around the edges of the case. Because that was what he used to call her. Because those 2 words carried an entire childhood inside them. Montana weekends. A girl of 10 learning to control her own heartbeat. A father's voice saying aim small, miss small. Sweetheart like it was the only sentence that ever mattered. He'd want you to have it, Marsh said quietly. She didn't trust her voice yet, so she just nodded. Lifted the rifle out of its case with both hands, feeling the balance of it settle into her palms like something coming home after a very long absence. Bannerman found her an hour later, running her fingers along the barrel one last time before the mission briefing. He stood in the doorway a moment before speaking, watching her the way a man watches something he doesn't entirely believe he's allowed to be part of. That's his. Yes, sir, you don't have to use it. He said it carefully, like he needed her to know the door was still open, even now, even this close to the edge of everything. We can pull another rifle from the armory. Nobody would think less of you. I would. She looked up at him. This is the only rifle I want in my hands out there. He held her gaze a long moment. Something passing between them that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the strange, unlikely debt sitting between their 2 families now, 5 years and 2 ambushes deep. Then let's go over the terrain, he said. The map spread across the table in Bannerman's container office. The compound circled in red where the hostages were believed held. A ridgeline marked in grease pencil 800 meters northeast, the most likely position for a professional to set up overwatch on the assault route. If I were Draven, Emery said, tracing the ridge with one finger, I'd take high ground with a clear sightline to every approach. This position, she tapped the map. Good cover, good concealment multiple ways out if things go wrong. Range to the compound from there? Reyes asked, leaning over the table. 600 meters, give or take. Comfortable range for him. She studied the terrain a moment longer, something working behind her eyes, which means I need to be somewhere he isn't looking. Somewhere too exposed to make sense as a sniper position. Her finger moved southwest, a shallow depression in the land, marked only faintly on the topographic overlay. Here. Low ground. Wrong instincts for a hide, which is exactly why it works. Marsh leaned in, studying the distance between the 2 points. That puts you at what, 1,200 meters from his position? 1,240, maybe 1,250 depending on exactly where he sets up. She said it flat, like a fact instead of a warning, though everyone in the room understood it was both. Coleman let out a low whistle. That's one hell of a shot, Doc. Especially against a man who's dug in and camouflaged. I know, Sergeant. She looked up, met his eyes. It's doable. With the right conditions. And the right hands. Are your hands the right ones? Bannerman asked. Quiet. Direct. She didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. They are. They inserted her 6 hours before the main assault, giving her time to move into position while there was still enough daylight to navigate the terrain and enough darkness left after to disappear into her hide before anyone on that ridge thought to look for her. 60 pounds of gear on her back, her father's rifle across it. The desert stretching out ahead of her in every direction, rust-colored and endless, the kind of landscape that swallowed sound and swallowed people with the same patient indifference. She moved the way she'd learned to move a lifetime ago, in places whose names still lived only in classified files. No straight lines, no pattern a trained eye could follow, just the slow, irregular drift of something that belonged to the land instead of moving across it. 2 hours to cover 3 kilometers. By the time she reached the depression, the sun was already sliding toward the horizon, throwing long gold light across sand that had seen better things happen on it and worse. She scraped out a shallow position, laid a thermal blanket beneath her to mask her heat signature, arranged scrub and stone until the hide looked like nothing at all, like wind, like erosion, like the ordinary chaos of a desert that had been doing this to itself for 10,000 years before she arrived to borrow a small piece of it. By the time she finished, a person could walk within 10 feet and never know she was there. She settled into position, prone, rifle steady on its bipod, eye to the scope, and began the part of this job that had always been the hardest. Not the shooting, the waiting. Night fell fast once it started falling. Temperature dropped from 90 degrees to 50 within 2 hours, and she lay in the sand and let it happen, refusing the thermal layer in her pack because comfort made a body slow, and slow was how you ended up dead. She watched the stars come out instead. Orion, Cassiopeia. The same constellations her father had taught her to navigate by, back before she understood why a person needed to know how to find their way by light that had left its source millions of years before either of them existed. Somewhere out there in the dark, Draven was doing the same thing, waiting, patient as stone. Her radio clicked once. Marsh checking in from the assault staging point. She clicked back. All quiet. The hours moved slow and then not at all. Her breathing settled into the rhythm her father had drilled into her 4 counts in. 7 held, 8 out, the pattern that lowered the heart rate and steadied the nerves and prepared the whole body for a moment that would be over in less time than it took to describe. Because this was the hardest part of it. Not the shot. The stillness before the shot. The hours where your own mind tried to talk you out of everything you'd already decided. She thought about her father, wondered if he'd ever lain like this, waiting for dawn and the small, terrible possibility of what dawn might bring. Probably. That was the job. Half your life spent in uncomfortable silence, waiting for a moment that would define everything that came after it. She thought about her mother. About the phone call 2 nights ago, the fear underneath the anger, the love that never once stopped showing itself, even when it was furious. She thought about Draven, a man connected somehow to the worst night of her life, a name she'd only just learned to attach to 5 years of grief. Did he have people who loved him somewhere? A story that made sense from the inside the way every story did, if you were the one living it. It didn't matter anymore. He'd chosen his path a long time ago. She'd chosen hers 5 nights back on a different ridge, and there was no half measure left between them now. Only the mathematics of trajectory and wind, and whichever one of them the desert decided to keep. Closed her eyes. Slept in careful 30-minute intervals, another trick her father had taught her. Never full sleep, just enough to rest the mind without losing the edge. Stay ready. Stay sharp. Dawn came slow, gray bleeding into the eastern sky, then pink, then the first hard line of gold cutting across the horizon like something had finally decided the night was over. Her radio clicked 3 times. Assault team moving. 45 minutes to compound. She settled deeper into the hide, began scanning the ridge through her scope, searching for the thing that didn't belong, the shadow too regular, the glint of light where light shouldn't gather, the tiny detail that would betray a human presence in a landscape built entirely out of stone and silence. Nothing yet, but he was there, had to be. Too perfect a position for a man who made his living hunting people who trusted the wrong terrain. 30 minutes. The light sharpened with every passing second, individual rocks resolving out of shadow, distinct shades of sand separating themselves from each other. 20 minutes. Movement on the ridge. Small, brief. Could have been wind through brush. Could have been an animal. Could have been a man settling into his final position. Her pulse held steady at 58 beats per minute. 4 counts in, 7 held, 8 out. The rhythm so deep in her body now it happened without her permission. Even as the rest of her mind worked through everything her eyes were showing her. 15 minutes. There a glint. Scope glass catching early sun for less than a second 800 meters northeast. Exactly where the terrain analysis had said it would be. She adjusted. 1,240 meters to target. Clicked elevation up, compensating for the massive drop a bullet would suffer over that kind of distance, nearly 90 inches by the time it arrived. Like throwing something over a 3-story building and expecting to land it on a coin. Wind from the east. 6 miles an hour steady for now. She clicked windage, adjusting left. Because at this range even a gentle breath of air could carry a bullet 2 feet off its intended line. The assault team was 5 minutes out. She could hear it now, faint, the distant mechanical growl of vehicles closing on the compound. Draven would hear it too, would already be settling behind his rifle, picking his target through the scope. Officers first. That was how you broke an assault before it started. Take the one giving orders, and watch the rest fall apart, trying to figure out who was supposed to give them next. She found him. Or found where he had to be, the barrel of his rifle extending just barely past the edge of expert camouflage, dark against pale stone. 4 minutes. The vehicles came into view now, dust rising against the brightening sky. Draven's rifle shifted, fractional tracking. 3 minutes. Her finger found the trigger. 2 pounds of pressure, halfway to the break point. 2 minutes. The assault team began deploying, moving toward the compound with the coordinated precision of men who'd rehearsed this 100 times and still understood, every single time, that rehearsal and reality were different animals wearing the same clothes. Draven's rifle steadied. He'd found his shot. 1 minute. She squeezed. The Remington roared. Recoil slammed into her shoulder, the scope losing the target for a fraction of a second in the violence of it. She cycled the bolt, ejected the spent brass, chambered a fresh round, found the ridge again through the settling dust of her own shot. Missed. The round had struck 10 feet from Draven's position, close enough to send stone fragments across him, close enough to announce to a professional exactly where his new problem was located, not close enough to matter. His rifle swung toward her, fast, already tracking her muzzle flash before she'd finished cycling the bolt. Her mind went cold in the specific way it always went cold when the math stopped being theoretical, because she'd misjudged the wind. It wasn't 6. It was closer to 9, maybe 10. And the correction arrived automatically, the way it always did now. Some part of her, having apparently never stopped doing this math, even through 8 years of pretending otherwise. She clicked windage, more, breathed, squeezed. The world exploded before she'd finished the motion. Not her shot. His. The impact hit before the sound of it did. A massive punch to her left shoulder, like being struck by something with the weight and intention of a swung bat. The Remington fell from her grip. She rolled instinctively, off the position, off the X, because moving was the only thing standing between her and dying in the exact spot she'd been aiming from. Pain arrived in waves after the first impact, white and total, radiating from her shoulder down through her fingertips and up into the base of her skull. She could tell without looking. Entry wound front, exit wound somewhere behind. The particular, terrible signature of a bullet that had passed all the way through. Her right hand found the medical kit strapped to her hip. Training overriding pain the way it always did, the way it had been trained to for years before she'd ever needed it to save her own life instead of someone else's. No tourniquet. This wasn't a limb wound that answered to a tourniquet. This needed packing. She shoved gauze into the entry wound with her right hand, bit down against the scream trying to claw its way out of her throat, packed it deep, pushed hard. The exit wound was worse. Bigger, ragged where the round had tumbled on its way through. More gauze, more pressure. Pain trying to gray out the edges of her vision until she forced it back with sheer refusal. Her hand found the morphine injector in her kit. Half dose. 5 milligrams instead of 10. Because she needed to stay functional. Needed to still be a threat. She jammed it into her thigh through her fatigues. The pain receded to something almost manageable. Not gone. Never gone. Just controlled enough to think, to move, to finish what she'd started. Gunfire erupted in the distance, the assault team engaging. moving on the compound now, exposed and vulnerable to exactly the kind of Overwatch fire she was supposed to be preventing. She had to move, had to get back into this. Her left arm hung useless at her side. Bone intact or not, it didn't matter right now. Getting into a proper prone position one-handed was a fight against physics her body wasn't going to win. She'd have to shoot sitting. Braced against stone. Unstable. Improvised. Everything her training said not to attempt. The world tilted sideways from blood loss and morphine and the particular vertigo of a body running on fumes. She fought for focus. Found it through nothing but will. Through the scope, blurred at the edges, she found Draven again. He'd shifted position, tracking the assault team now, confident, believing the threat behind him neutralized. 1,240 meters. Wounded. Bleeding. Morphine slowing everything down by some percentage she didn't have the clarity left to calculate. Shooting one-handed from a braced sitting position that no manual anywhere would call acceptable. Her father's voice arrived, clear as if he were kneeling right beside her in the dirt. There's no such thing as impossible, sweetheart. Only difficult. And difficult is what we train for. She wedged the rifle against the stone. Right hand on the grip. Left arm dead weight at her side. Cheek to stock, eye to scope, breathe in, hold out. Found him in the reticle. He'd gotten careless. Believed her finished. That was his mistake to make. She calculated everything her compromised body could still calculate: wind, distance, the tremor in her hand from blood loss, the softness at the edges of her vision from morphine, the instability of a shooting position built entirely out of improvisation. She compensated for all of it. Clicked elevation, windage, found the space between what her mind knew and what her body could actually deliver, and aimed for that space instead of for perfection. The assault team breached the compound gate below. 30 seconds until they were fully exposed to the ridge. 20. Draven's finger tightened on his own trigger. She could see it through the scope, the small, terrible commitment of his whole body toward a shot he was about to take. 10. She squeezed. The Remington bucked against her wounded shoulder. Pain exploded through her entire left side, white and blinding, dragging at the edges of her consciousness like something trying to pull her under. She fought it. Stayed conscious through nothing but refusal. Stayed aware long enough to watch, through the scope, the bullet travel. 1,240 meters of empty air and wind and a universe that owed nobody anything. It found him. Center mass. Exactly where she'd aimed, despite the wound, despite the drugs, despite a shooting position that should never have produced a shot this clean. He fell, dropped his rifle, tried to crawl and couldn't, went still, no longer a threat. The radio came alive with voices moving too fast to follow clearly. Hostiles down. Hostages secure. 2 civilians alive and unharmed. All Marines accounted for. Mission complete, and Emery let the rifle fall from her right hand and sat back against the stone, the whole left side of her body on fire despite the morphine. Blood soaking through the packing faster than she liked. She'd need extraction soon. Would need surgery. Recovery measured in weeks instead of days. But they'd done it. The hostages were alive. Draven was dead. She keyed her radio with her right hand. Voice weaker than she wanted it to sound, but clear enough to be understood. Marsh. Mission complete. Draven's down, confirmed. I'm hit shoulder. Need extraction, static. Then his voice, tight with a fear he didn't bother hiding. Copy, Doc. Medevac inbound, ETA 15. Stay with us. Not planning on going anywhere, Chief. She wasn't. Her mother had already buried one Calloway to this desert. She refused to be the second. She pulled out another pressure bandage one-handed. Awkward. Difficult. She managed anyway, pressed it against the wound, held it there with her right palm, and waited. The helicopter arrived 18 minutes later, rotors beating salvation into the desert air, the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard in her life. Coleman was first out, ran to her position, saw the blood, saw her face gone pale, and something in his expression cracked open with an emotion he clearly hadn't expected to be feeling. Jesus, Doc. He started an IV line with hands that were far gentler than the rest of him. Your shot took out Draven? 1,240 meters. While wounded, her voice had gone distant, drifting somewhere just past her own control. Had to be done. You did more than good, Doc. He looked at her like he was seeing something he'd need a while to fully believe. You did impossible. The hospital was morphine and white light for longer than she could later account for. Surgery. Recovery. Voices somewhere overhead saying words like lucky and close and full recovery expected. She drifted between Montana and the desert, and a place that wasn't quite either, where sometimes her father's voice spoke to her in fragments she couldn't hold on to once she woke. When full consciousness finally arrived, 3 days had passed. Bannerman was sitting in the chair beside her bed. "Welcome back, Calloway." Her throat felt like sand. He handed her water. She drank slow. "How long?" 3 days. Surgery went clean. Through and through, missed everything critical. "You'll make a full recovery." He hesitated, something working behind his tired eyes. "Draven's confirmed. Assault team found him exactly where your shot put him." She nodded slowly. "Let that settle. There's more you need to hear," he said, "and some of it's going to be hard." Fenwick came by that same afternoon, still in his desert fatigues. Dust from the compound still ground into the creases of his boots like he hadn't stopped to change before driving over. He stood in the doorway a moment, awkward, a small paper bag clutched in one hand like he wasn't sure it was an appropriate thing to bring. "Doc," he cleared his throat, "brought you something. It's not much." Inside the bag, candy bar and a folded copy of a local newspaper, already 3 days old, the front page carrying a story about water rights that had nothing to do with any of them. "Figured you'd be bored out of your mind in here," he said, "and hungry for something that isn't hospital food. Thank you, Fenwick." She managed something close to a smile despite the ache still radiating down her arm. "You didn't have to." "Yeah, I did." He pulled the chair closer to her bed, sat, elbows on his knees, looking younger than his 23 years in the flat hospital light. "You saved my life in that heat drill. Then you went and did whatever that was, out on that ridge. Some things you just have to show up for, Doc. That's how I was raised." "How's the rest of the platoon?" "Shaken, proud, mad at you a little, for scaring the hell out of everybody." He tried for a grin, and mostly managed it. "Coleman's been walking around telling anybody who'll listen that he called it early. Says he knew you were something else from day one. He absolutely did not know that." "No," Fenwick agreed, grinning properly now. "But nobody's going to tell him that to his face." They talked a while about small things: the heat, a card game running nightly in the rec tent, a training exercise scheduled for the following month that Fenwick was nervous about, and trying not to show it. Ordinary conversation, the kind that had nothing to do with rifles or ridgelines, and Emery found herself grateful for it in a way she hadn't expected. "Can I ask you something, Doc?" Fenwick said eventually. Quieter now. "You're going to anyway." A small laugh. "Are you going to be okay?" "Not the shoulder. I mean all of it. Your dad and everything that came out about it, and now this." She considered the question honestly before answering, because he'd asked it honestly, and he deserved better than a reflexive reassurance. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think I will be, eventually." That's a real answer. He nodded slowly, like he was filing it away for later, for whenever his own turn came to need one. "Good. I was worried you'd just tell me you were fine." "I'm not fine, Fenwick. I'm getting there." "That's better than fine," he said, and meant it, and she found she believed him. He left 20 minutes later, with a promise to bring better snacks next time, and Emery lay back against the pillows feeling something loosen in her chest that had nothing to do with the wound. Reyes arrived the following afternoon, laptop under his arm, expression carrying the particular weight of a man about to deliver something too large for casual conversation. "We finished processing everything from Draven's effects," he said, pulling a chair close to her bed. "Comms records, financial documents, an encrypted drive we finally cracked 2 days ago. It's a bigger picture than we thought. Corpsman Calloway, considerably bigger." Marsh stood near the window, Bannerman by the door. Both of them watching her the way you watch someone right before you tell them something you already suspect will break part of them open. "Draven wasn't running this alone," Reyes said. "He was Corvidae's enforcement arm. But an operation feeding intelligence, this precisely, for this many years, needs someone positioned inside the actual chain of command, someone with access." "Corvid Dynamics' leadership," Emery said. "Their leadership, yes. But the leak on this base, the one that put your unit into that ambush 2 weeks ago, that's Pete's we've been chasing since before you shot Draven." Reyes turned the laptop toward her. A face on the screen, uniformed, mid-50. The kind of face that looked entirely unremarkable in exactly the way that made betrayal possible. Major Preston Wolcott, Regional Logistics Command. Access to patrol schedules, convoy routes, base movements across 3 installations. including this one. Emery stared at the face, felt something cold settle low in her chest. He fed them everything, she said slowly. For years, we believe. Financial records show payments routed through 4 different shell accounts back to Corvid subsidiaries, going back at least 6 years. Reyes' voice tightened. Draven's own files cross-reference Wolcott directly coordinate requests, logistics access, all of it running through the same channel for most of a decade. 6 years. Emery repeated. The words landed and everything in her went very still, which puts him in position, timeline-wise, to have compromised the coordinates on the operation that killed your father. Reyes met her eyes without flinching from what he was saying. We can't undo what happened 5 years ago, but we can make sure it stops happening to somebody else's father. The room went very still. You're telling me, Emery said, very quietly, that the reason my father died 5 years ago is a logistics officer who sold information to a defense contractor for money, and that Draven was the hand carrying out what Wolcott made possible. I'm telling you, the evidence points that direction, strongly. She sat with that for a long time after they'd left. Bannerman lingered longest, standing near the door with his hand on the frame, not quite ready to leave. I spent 5 years, he said finally, believing that night was just bad luck. Wrong place. Wrong timing. War being war. His voice had gone rough. Turns out it wasn't luck at all. Somebody sold us that coordinate on purpose, and somebody else made sure the wrong man was waiting when it mattered. That doesn't make it easier, sir. No. He looked at her, something steady settling behind his tired eyes. But it means there's something we can actually do about it now. Something your father never got the chance to do. What's that? Make sure it costs the people responsible everything it's supposed to cost them. His jaw set. Reyes wants your statement. Full account. Everything on the record. Not to protect Corvid's lawyers from a mess, to bury them in one. Emery looked down at her bandaged shoulder, at the shape of a decision that had already made itself somewhere in the last 3 days, whether she'd fully caught up to it yet or not. I'll give him everything, she said, all of it. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Once her statement went into the file, corroborated by Marsh's account, by Coleman's, by the physical evidence recovered from both compounds and everything pulled off Draven's body. Wolcott was arrested 11 days later at a regional command post 4 states away, taken into custody without incident, though the incident that followed in the press wasn't quiet at all. Federal indictments came down within a month: conspiracy, arms trafficking, accessory charges tied to 2 deaths on record, and quietly suspected in connection to more. Corvid Dynamics collapsed under the weight of a Department of Defense Inspector General investigation that Reyes' office had apparently been building for over a year, waiting only for the crack that finally gave them enough to move. 3 executives indicted. Federal contracts terminated. The company's name became, within a season, a cautionary case study instead of a functioning business. None of it brought her father back, but something in Emery loosened, slightly, reading the indictment the day it was unsealed. Not closure, exactly. She'd learned enough by then to know grief didn't close like a door. It just changed shape. This felt like the shape changing into something she could finally set down, at least partway, instead of carrying alone. The letter arrived 2 weeks later, forwarded through Bannerman from a box of personal effects the Navy had shipped home 5 years ago, and nobody had known what to do with. Standard military envelope. Sealed. Her name on the front in her father's handwriting. Her hands shook opening it. 2 pages. Dated 3 weeks before he died. Folded the way a man folds something he means for someone to find only after he's gone. Emery, if you're reading this, I didn't make it home. I'm sorry for that. Sorry I won't see you grow older. Won't be there for the moments that matter most. But I'm not sorry for what I taught you. The shooting. The discipline. The hard skills of a hard trade. I taught you those things because I saw something in you early, a steadiness, a precision, the kind of mind that could make the difficult choice and carry the weight of it afterward without breaking under it. Your mother is going to want you to walk away from all of it. She'll beg you to be safe, to be ordinary, and maybe you should. This life isn't easy, and I never wanted it to be the only path open to you. But if it calls you back anyway, if you can't fully walk away from it, then know this. There's no shame in being what you are. A healer and a fighter, both. We talked about this once. Medicine and marksmanship come from the same place. The need to fix what's broken. Sometimes you fix it with a suture. sometimes with a steady hand and a single careful shot. I taught you to shoot not because I wanted you to take lives. I taught you because I wanted you to have options, to be capable, to protect the people who need protecting when protection is the only thing left that works. Use it wisely, use it rarely, but use it without hesitation when the moment truly demands it. I'm proud of you, Emery, proud of who you are already, proud of who you're going to become. And if the day ever comes where keeping a promise to me or your mother means standing by while people who needed you got hurt instead, then break it. Promises to the dead matter less than the lives of the living. I would understand. I do understand wherever I am now. Be well, sweetheart. Be strong. Be yourself. Love, Dad. P.S. Aim small, miss small. And remember, precision saves lives, always. She read it 3 times. By the 3rd pass, tears moved silently down her face. The kind of crying that came without sound, without struggle, just release. 5 years of grief and guilt finally finding somewhere to go. He had known. Somehow, 3 weeks before an ambush he couldn't have predicted, he had known she might someday face exactly this choice, and he had left her permission to make it before she'd even understood she'd need it. 6 weeks later, her shoulder healed enough for travel. Emery flew home to Montana. The ranch looked the way it always looked in early autumn: gold grass rolling out toward mountains, still holding traces of last winter's snow on their highest ridges, the porch light already on though it wasn't yet dark. The particular quiet of a place, built for a family of 3 that had learned to hold itself together with just 2. Her mother was waiting on the porch steps before the truck had even fully stopped. Marlo Calloway crossed the yard faster than a woman her age should have been able to move, and Emery met her halfway. And for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, just held on. I got your letter, her mother said finally, pulling back just far enough to look at her daughter's face. The one from the hospital. About what happened out there. I'm sorry, Mom. Stop. Her mother's hand came up, gentle, pressed flat against Emery's cheek. I've had 6 weeks to think about what I wanted to say to you when you got home, and it isn't sorry. I don't want to hear you say sorry. Then what do you want to hear? Her mother's eyes filled. And this time she let them, didn't fight it back the way she usually did. I want to hear that you're not ashamed, she said. Of any of it. The rifle. Your father's training. What you did out there to save people I've never met and never will. Her voice broke slightly. Because I was ashamed of it, Emery. For 5 years. I blamed that part of him, that part of you, for taking him away from me. And I tried to make you promise it away, like a promise could undo what your father actually was. Mom, let me finish. She took a breath, steadying herself. I found out what really happened. Bannerman called me, told me everything, the coordinates, the man who sold them, all of it. Her hand tightened slightly against Emery's face. Your father didn't die because of who he was, Emery. He died because somebody sold him out for money. And you went out into that same desert, and you finished something he never got the chance to. You stopped the next version of it from happening to somebody else's family. Emery couldn't speak, just stood there in the gold evening light with her mother's hand still resting against her cheek, feeling something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 5 years finally begin, slowly, to open. I'm not asking you to promise me anything anymore, her mother said quietly. I don't think I have the right to ask that of you. Not after everything I've learned. I'm only asking you to come home when you can, however often that ends up being. I can do that, Emery whispered. I can promise that much. Her mother pulled her back into an embrace, and this time Emery let herself cry too. The 2 of them standing together in the last of the day's light, widow and daughter, both finally learning how to carry the same grief without letting it pull either one of them under. 6 months after that, Emery stood at the front of a classroom at a training facility outside Quantico, Virginia. 24 faces looked back at her 12 combat medics. 12 designated marksmen, ages ranging from early 20s to late 30s, every one of them a volunteer for a program that had barely existed on paper 8 months earlier. Integrated combat medicine. The pilot curriculum approved in the wake of an after-action review that had, eventually, made its way up through channels far above her pay grade, carried there partly by a colonel's insistence, and partly by a story that had traveled through the ranks faster than any official report ever could. Good morning, she said, standing very straight despite the shoulder that still ached in cold weather, and probably always would. I'm Corpsman Calloway. For the next 8 weeks, I'm going to ask you to think differently about your jobs than you've ever been trained to think about them before. A hand went up near the front. Young face, careful posture, the specific alertness of someone determined to prove they belonged. Ma'am, isn't it better to be excellent at one thing than average at two?
Good question.
She let it hang a moment. The answer is no, because combat doesn't respect your job description. The situation changes in seconds. The medic might need to return fire. The shooter might need to stop someone from bleeding out in front of him. If you can only do one of those things, people die who didn't have to. She advanced to the next slide. A photograph, carefully anonymized, taken from a night that still visited her sometimes in dreams she didn't share with anyone. This is a combat medic providing emergency treatment while under direct fire. Notice her weapon positioning. Notice she never once loses awareness of the threat around her, even while her hands are doing something else entirely. She let the room sit with the image. She's not choosing between healer and fighter. She's both, in the same 60 seconds, because the moment demanded both. The room leaned forward, slow, the particular quiet of understanding beginning to take root. She spent the next 8 weeks teaching them to move between roles the way she'd learned to move between them, not as separate skills bolted awkwardly together, but as two halves of the same discipline, the same steady hand, applied to different kinds of saving. Some struggled. The medics who couldn't reconcile healing with violence. The marksmen who went pale at the sight of blood they hadn't caused themselves. But most adapted. Most grew into something larger than what they'd arrived as. On graduation day, Bannerman appeared in the back of the room. Marsh beside him. Coleman too, in dress uniform, looking faintly uncomfortable the way he always did outside a field environment. They watched her hand certificates to 24 students who'd just completed the hardest training program most of them would ever undergo, and something in Bannerman's expression, watching her do it, looked like a man finally setting down a debt he'd carried for 25 years and finding, underneath it, something that had grown into gratitude instead. Afterward, he pulled her aside. Marine Corps wants to expand this, he said. 6 additional training sites. Hundreds of students over the next year. That's good news, sir. Army's interested too. Air Force is asking questions. He shook his head slightly, something almost like wonder in it. They're already calling it the Callaway method in some of the internal memos. I told them to stop. Nobody listens to me anymore, apparently. She almost laughed. The first real laugh she'd felt in longer than she wanted to admit. It shouldn't be special, sir, she said. It should just be standard. The smart way to train people who might have to do both jobs in the same 60 seconds. You changed something real, Callaway. We changed it, she said, all of us. Starting with a man who knew 25 years ago exactly what it meant to hold both things in the same 2 hands. Bannerman didn't answer that. Just nodded, slow, and let the silence carry what neither of them needed to say out loud. That spring, Emery stood again in the small Montana cemetery outside the town where she'd grown up. Spring wind moving through pine and new grass, the headstone in front of her simple and plain, in the way her father had always been plain about everything, except the things that mattered most. Colter Callaway, United States Navy husband. Father, she knelt, placed fresh flowers against the stone. Hi, Dad. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Sorry it's been a while. The stone offered no reply. It never had. But she felt something anyway, some quiet presence settling around her the way it always did out here in this particular corner of ground. The program's working, she said. Trained over 200 students already. They keep calling it my method, which I keep telling them isn't accurate. It's yours. I'm just the one who finally stopped being ashamed to use it. Wind moved through the pines above her, soft, steady. I found out what really happened to you, she said, quieter now. Wasn't luck. Wasn't just war being war. Somebody sold that coordinate to the people who killed you. He's in federal custody now. So is the man he sold it to. She paused, letting that settle into the ground the way she needed it to settle into herself. It doesn't bring you back. I know that. But it means it stops here. It doesn't happen to somebody else's father. She stood, placed her palm flat against the warm stone. Mom's doing better, she said. We talk every week now. She came to Quantico, watched me teach. I think she finally understands why I couldn't fully walk away. Why I had to be both things you raised me to be. A truck door closed somewhere behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Her mother crossed the grass slowly, settled beside her at the stone, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, just stood together in the thin spring sunlight, looking at the name carved into granite that had shaped both their lives in ways neither of them had fully chosen. "He'd be so proud of you," her mother said softly. "I know, Mom. Are you happy?" Her mother turned to look at her, really look, the way she used to before grief had made looking too hard for either of them. "Doing this work, this new program, are you actually happy?" Emery thought about the classroom full of students learning to carry two truths in the same two hands. Thought about her mother's voice on the phone, softer now than it had been in years. Thought about a letter folded carefully in a drawer at home, permission granted from a man 5 years gone who had somehow known, all along, exactly what his daughter would need to hear. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. "I am." Her mother took her hand, squeezed it once, gentle the way you hold on to something you've learned not to take for granted anymore. They stood together a while longer in the quiet Montana afternoon, widow and daughter, both of them finally learning to honor the man they'd lost not by staying safe in his memory, but by living fully in the shape of everything he'd actually taught them to be. The wind moved on through the pines. The mountains held their snow a little longer against the coming spring, and somewhere out past the horizon, in classrooms and training fields scattered now across half a dozen states, a new generation of medics and marksmen were learning, one careful lesson at a time, to carry life in both hands. Precision saves lives. Her father had been right about that. He always had been.